Is this a new low in the border wars?
What's happened here is heartbreaking. I mean, that girl and that family will never be able to get that moment back. And I mean, as you say, I mean, the ICT has had 0 active cases for months, has had 0 locally acquired community transmission for months. That girl did not present a risk just for, holding her dad's hand while he was passing away, or comforting her mum and her sister after her dad passed away. I mean, what happened here is just, plain disgraceful. And I'm sure that would be the overwhelming view of people all around Australia. I mean, people have got to be careful not to lose their humanity here. And in terms of risk versus, what should have happened here, it is completely and utterly disproportionate. I just can't get my head around that somebody could be so cold-hearted and so harsh and so nasty to prevent a girl in those circumstances to say farewell to her dad and be there with her family while they're grieving his loss. I mean, I just can't get my head around it.
Is that what you think is happening here, that we have lost, or not everyone, but a lot of people have lost their sense of humanity?
Like, clearly some people have made judgments that being harsh in terms of state border closures is, offering the opportunity for political upside in the lead up to an election. And, this is just a heartbreaking example why that is just completely and utterly the wrong thing to do. I mean, at least show some humanity in these sorts of circumstances and make a genuine assessment of the actual risk. I mean, nobody can tell me that the people of Queensland would have been exposed to risk because somebody, went to see her dad, somebody from a jurisdiction that is in a better position than Queensland, that has, in literally a better position than Queensland.
The Premier made a point yesterday too when she was asked about it, that she said it wasn't her decision. It was Jeanette Young, the Chief Health Officer's decision to make. And then she went to say...
She's only the Premier of the state. Well, she's only the Premier of the state. I mean, that's, really? I mean, honestly, you can't tell me that if the Premier of Queensland had said to the Chief Health Medical Officer, let's be compassionate, proportionate and sensible here. Let's have a common sense, empathetic, caring response to this. Let's recognise the fact that there are 0 cases in the ICT. There have been 0 cases for months. There has not been a locally acquired transmission in the ICT for months. You can't tell me that the Premier of Queensland, if she had so chosen, would not have been persuasive in getting a more caring and more appropriate outcome here.
No, it's difficult to argue with that point, that's for sure. Meanwhile, Jeanette Young did say that, there had been exemptions given to sports stars, sport teams, the AFL executive teams. You also had Tom Hanks, the actor, so Hollywood are getting special passes, while other people, and it's not just this young 26-year-old, we're hearing and we're seeing more cases now of people wanting to get across the border to see sick or dying loved ones, and they can't do it. So, there is the suggestion of double standards.
Well, this is completely being mismanaged, and people across Queensland, I'm sure, will turn against this. I mean, the inconsistency and the inequity. But as you say, I mean, to treat people on one side, with open arms, and I'm not arguing against that. Incidentally, I'm not saying be harsher on one side. I'm just saying be consistent and be empathetic. And I mean, as I say, I'm just so distressed for that poor family and other families like it who get caught up in what is, quite frankly, a political situation that is entirely driven by the fact that there is an election in Queensland in October, and it shouldn't be like this.
But it's not just Queensland; it's all states. I mean, everyone's got a dog in this fight. I mean, it's WA as well.
Well, it's not all states. That's not true. It's not all states. I mean, South Australia, for example, is not doing this. I mean, WA is also, imposing these sorts of restrictions, and all states should be empathetic, certainly on compassionate grounds. I mean, I'm not aware of any cases in Western Australia like the one that we've witnessed, in Queensland out of the ICT. But having said that, I mean, in Western Australia, I am aware of families that get stuck in this. I mean, where there are kids stuck interstate and stuff like this. But all states should be practical, commonsensical, and empathetic, and proportionate to the risk that is actually there, rather than just focusing on the political approach.
But I mean, I guess some critics also say that Australians should be able to go overseas to see sick and dying loved ones, but they're not allowed to at the moment because of the stance of the federal government.
Well, I don't disagree, and my view would be that in cases where there are empathetic, where there are compassionate reasons, then they should be given these sorts of permissions. And to be frank, I mean, I've had cases where I've dealt with these sorts of matters, and I've been able to support people through those sorts of processes. And I'm sure that I mean, when there are cases like this, I would be very surprised if people weren't granted an exemption in those circumstances.
Well, I mean, it's proving here that the federal government is powerless, though, because the premiers are calling the shots. They've got all the cards. So what happens long term here if these border restrictions are in place for months, maybe a year away? What kind of federal intervention is needed here? I mean, may you withdraw GST? Could that be an option?
Well, no, I mean, that's not an option. I mean, in the end, and I know that this is not, popular everywhere, but there is a case in front of the High Court, and the High Court will ultimately be called upon to resolve the constitutional situation. That is a reality. But over time, I think people in all of those jurisdictions will put pressure on their governments to take a more sensible, more appropriate approach to these things. I mean, when we've got 4 jurisdictions who've had 0 active cases and 0 community transmission for some time. There is no reasonable, proportionate ground on which to prevent people interacting with each other from those jurisdictions. I mean, there is no risk, no additional risk by engaging with somebody from a jurisdiction where there are 0 active cases and 0 locally acquired community transmission. And over time, I mean, that rationality, I'm confident, will impose itself even, on the most recalcitrant state government in relation to these matters.
So at what point would you get the courts involved?
Sorry?
At what point would you get, or could you get the courts involved?
No, well, we're not getting the courts involved. I mean, there are cases that were initiated by others. We're not party to them, but the High Court, will clearly, at some point, if this case continues, which it appears it is, I mean, at some point the High Court will have to make a decision. I mean, I understand from what's been publicly reported that, this is going to be dealt with by the High Court in November, and, that's clearly going to be a matter for them.